As you know, we are going over to London to participate in the McRobertson International Race from London to Australia.
It's October 1934. Air transportation in America has been revolutionized by the new Boeing airliner, the 247. Roscoe Turner and his co-pilot Clyde Pangborn will fly one in the McRobertson Air Race from Mildenhall, England to Melbourne, Australia. They'll compete against another commercial airliner, the Douglas DC-2. The field includes many smaller and apparently faster airplanes. The world of aviation is in for a surprise. The Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum is the most visited museum in the world. Its collection contains some of the most important aircraft and spacecraft in history. Craft that were designed, built, and flown by men and women who have expanded the frontiers of flight. In the second half of the 1920s, air transportation advanced quickly. When Henry Ford got into the airplane business and introduced the trimotor in 1926, the Ford name convinced many people who had never left the ground before that flying was now safe. But the trimotor was ungainly and slow. And when Boeing introduced their sleek new 10-passenger 247 in 1933, a new age of air transportation began. The Boeing 247 could cruise at almost 3 miles a minute and carry its passengers right across America in 19 hours. But its period of supremacy was brief. The Douglas DC-3 was the first airplane that could make money just by carrying passengers. It quickly gained a lead in the airline business that lasted many years. This is the story of the growth of air transportation between the two world wars and the way it changed our lives. Today, this is a sight we take for granted. Airplanes carrying hundreds of passengers land and take off at busy airports around the world every few seconds. No major center in the world is more than a day's travel away. In the early 1920s, few children could have dreamed that within a lifetime so much progress would be made. When Henry Ford entered the airplane business in 1925, the Kelly Act had just been passed, allowing private contractors to bid for airmail carrying services. The successful low bidder would receive the majority of his revenue from the mail. Ford bought out a company owned by designer William B. Stout and fitted out one of his metal airplanes, the 2AT, as an air freight and mail carrier. He called it the Maiden Dearborn. Stout was influenced by the all-metal airplanes of German designer Hugo Junkers. The 2AT was a single-engined aircraft, but the new lightweight Wright Whirlwind radial engine encouraged Stout to experiment with a 3-engine design. The first Ford trimotor, the 3AT, was a strange-looking airplane. Airflow over the 3 engines and the ungainly nose was so bad that it couldn't be landed with the power off. It only had 3 flights before a mysterious fire in the factory in January 1926 destroyed it and some other airplanes designed by Stout. In 1927, long-distance passengers had to be tough. Accompanying the mail from Chicago to San Francisco in the cramped passenger seats of a Boeing 40, just behind the throbbing 410 horsepower Wasp radial engine, could not have been a pleasant experience. At the time, in spite of the Air Commerce Act, not all pilots who carried passengers were licensed yet.
I sold on a Tuesday, and that Saturday I took my first passenger, which was my sister, and it occurred in the morning. That afternoon I was carrying passengers like crazy.
In May 1927, Charles Lindbergh's flight from New York to Paris inspired great interest in aviation.
When I learned about that, this particular morning was about May the 22nd, as I remember, 1927. At breakfast that morning, I announced to the family, my mother and father and sister, I decided to become an aviator. And my mother thought, "That was wonderful, Tony. Just remember, be a good one."
Actually, the first memory I have in my life is sitting on the curb watching Lindbergh go by when he on his triumphant tour of New York and Brooklyn. And I was terribly interested in aviation from then on, I guess. As I got a little older, I got to fly a couple of times when I was about 7 or 8. And I lived not far from Floyd Bennett Field, where many of the famous flights went. So I was really involved in it and read all the pulp magazines and kept up with all the news on airplanes and racing.
And I became the official airport brat and grease monkey. I was accepted. And of course, you have to have that. In those days, you had to have a kid that would do anything. And I did anything.
Well, I just thought there was nothing like flying. I hooked a ride every time I could possibly talk anyone into taking me up. And I could look so forlorn standing at the fence that they couldn't resist me.
The deep social changes of the 1920s inspired some crazy attempts to seek new experiences and abuse the human body. But the rigors of a transcontinental run or the extended agony of a dance marathon couldn't match the thrill, challenge, and ultimate satisfaction of taking off in an old biplane with a flying instructor for a first flying lesson.
He took me up high and put it into a stall. He wanted to show me a stall, and he described it. Flying the airplane too slowly at too high an angle of attack, and I could feel it quivering, and then pretty soon the stick came back and the nose would plunge violently down, and it did. And it frightened me.
In the late 20s, there was also a boom in the number of people flying as passengers. Ford's new trimotor inspired confidence in air transportation. It also inspired a number of competitors, among them the trimotored biplane, the Boeing 80. Only 12 of these luxury machines were built. They were operated by Boeing Air Transport, which, after a number of mergers and takeovers by Boeing, evolved into United Airlines. Competition to attract the growing number of passengers was intense. American Airways and Transcontinental Air Transport were among the airlines operating Ford trimotors. They offered passengers safety, a cruising speed of just over 100 miles an hour, and 2 rows of lightweight wicker seats. By 1930, the Boeing conglomerate United Aircraft and Transport Company was not only the biggest airline operator in America, it also controlled the manufacture of Pratt & Whitney engines and Hamilton propellers, and it introduced the idea of flight attendants. Meanwhile, Tony LeVere, like many other young Americans, was still having trouble with the reality of learning to fly.
This time he stalled it and pulled the stick back and kicked the rudder, and we went into a spin, and it snapped in, nose down, and now it started to swirl around, and it gave me the impression that the world was turning and not us. And we made a couple of turns, and he kicked it to the right and made a couple to the right and came out. And I'll be perfectly frank with you, it scared the hell out of me. And then we came down and landed, and I was almost ill. And I thanked him, and I decided to go home. And I went to the curb at the boulevard to flag a ride, and I was so ill that I sat down for perhaps 15 minutes until I regained my composure. And in that 15 minutes, I thought, here, I want to become a pilot so badly, and this flight kind of ruined my thought because I didn't think I could measure up to stand that.
But young Tony persisted, and soon his performance improved. He soloed in spectacular fashion.
And I dove it down, not dangerously close to the ground, but I was moving pretty fast. I didn't have an airspeed indicator, but I was whistling and zoomed up. And as the RPM slowed up, I pushed the nose over, and at that same instant, now I'm in level flight, for some dumb reason, I decided to make a turn to the left, and I started it and pulled it back quite sharply, and this darn little airplane snapped into a snap roll and a spin. And I wasn't more than maybe 400 or 500 feet high. And as it snapped, I knew I'd made a terrible, terrible mistake, but I responded immediately with chopping the power, putting the stick full forward and full opposite rudder, which was right rudder. And this darn thing made a turn and a half and stopped, and I almost retraced the path from which I came in. If somebody had been watching, they thought, boy, there's a hot pilot.
The increasing numbers of people learning to fly also led to the design and production of small airplanes for personal transportation. But they were still the province of the rich. The race to carry greater numbers of passengers went on. In late 1928, the Keystone Company built a tri-motored monoplane called the Patrician, capable of carrying 20 passengers. The first of these passengers had a splendid and unusual view of the skyline of New York. The first Patrician was tested out on a flight across America to Los Angeles and back. In Los Angeles, the Keystone publicity machine naturally took the opportunity to demonstrate their airplane's ability to successfully carry a load of more than 20 Hollywood starlets. It appeared to do the job with great success. The first Keystone Patrician went into service on charter to Colonial Air Transport, carrying passengers on the run from New York to Boston. The Patrician had 3 Wright Cyclone engines of over 500 horsepower each, but in spite of this power and lifting advantage, it never seriously challenged the Ford Trimotor. The most successful and famous Ford Trimotor was the 5AT, introduced in 1928. It had Pratt & Whitney Wasp engines of 410 horsepower each and could carry 14 or 15 passengers. Ford Trimotors were flown by more than 100 airlines around the world, and even though production finished in 1933, they continued to serve for many years. In the early 30s, Tex Johnston flew one, carrying passengers for a barnstorming troupe.
In those days, very few people had flown, and you had to use a little salesmanship to sell people. They were basically afraid of airplanes. And so we worked up pretty good, words to tell them about the safety of it and so forth. And a lot of them liked riding in the closed airplane better than the open airplanes. The other airplanes were open airplanes. We had 3 open airplanes that were barnstorming.
The Ford's all-metal construction made it strong and robust. It was an inherently stable airplane, but very heavy to fly.
It's a really physical job to fly that airplane. The control forces are high on all three axes, longitudinal, lateral, and rudder directionally. And the control movement required is much more than it is today. Today you just move the controls a little bit and it's very sensitive. But you really had to manhandle that airplane. Between the pilot seat and the co-pilot seat there was a lever about this high, and you pull straight back on it, you got both brakes. You pull it over to the right, you got the right brake, or left, you got the left brake. And that was an entirely new experience. And of course the performance was not very outstanding. And the airplane was heavy, and the controls were heavy, and so it was work to fly it, but it was at least flying, and that was what it was all about.
And for passenger comfort, it was a great improvement over anything most people had experienced in the air. At least they were sitting inside.
Well, there's always noisy in the open airplanes, of course, but the Ford was very comfortable. It had wicker seats because they were lightweight, and the airplane was relatively quiet inside. It didn't fly very fast, so there wasn't much airflow noise. And the performance wasn't outstanding, but it took off and flew and landed, and that was the name of the game in those days.
The three engines gave it a lot of more security to the people. The fact that Ford made it, people trusted Ford and the Ford automobile, so because he made the airplane, they thought it would be safer.
The combination of ruggedness, reliability, and the persuasiveness of the Ford name made the Ford Trimotor by far the most successful of the airliners of the late 20s. Not all Trimotors used the standard wicker seats. Some had customized interiors that added space and luxury to the Trimotor's other virtues. Transcontinental Air Transport, the forerunner of TWA, with Charles Lindbergh as chairman of its technical committee, used the Ford airplane on the first scheduled transcontinental passenger service. At that stage of development, the airlines couldn't offer a transcontinental service that relied on airplanes alone. TAT promoted the idea of a route that combined air and rail transportation. The transcontinental component relied on air and rail, using Ford Trimotors in the air in daylight hours and railway sleeper transport at night. Columbus, Ohio was the end of the first rail leg of the trip for TAT's transcontinental passengers. The year was 1929, and each of these passengers paid $350, a large sum of money in those days, to make the trip. Each passenger was allowed 30 pounds of baggage for the flight. 8:15 in the morning was takeoff time from Columbus. It would take a total of 48 hours from the time they left New York on the train until their Ford Trimotor landed in Los Angeles. The Trimotor's cruising speed of 107 miles an hour outdistanced the train. Airplanes in those days couldn't fly above the weather. A comprehensive weather reporting system was essential for the safety of the service. The first stop was Indianapolis, then another 2 hours to St. Louis for a 15-minute stop for fuel and mechanical inspection. After takeoff, lunch in the air and on to Kansas City. next stop would be Wichita, Kansas, the next to last for the day.
Westbound plane calling radio ground station at Wichita.
TAT Maddox, radio ground station at Wichita, answering westbound plane.
Westbound plane reporting position. We are now passing over Granville.
Okay on your position. Are you on time? Go ahead, please.
We are flying exactly on schedule. We'll arrive Wichita on time.
The final stop on day one was Waynoka in Oklahoma, where the passengers were taken by trailer to board the Santa Fe Railway for the overnight journey to New Mexico. The next morning, they boarded another trimotor for a series of hops across New Mexico and Arizona. Finally, late in the afternoon, Los Angeles in California.
Plane from New York and the east, arriving 4:20 on time.
The flight had taken just under 2 days from departure by rail in New York to touchdown. Even though the party in this TAT promotional film looked fresh and happy as they step off the plane, it must have been a grueling journey. But speeds were increasing, the world was shrinking, and new things were becoming possible in the air. In April 1930, Henry J. Cobbs and his orchestra scored a first by performing while flying in a Ford trimotor above Curtis Field in New York. It wasn't a major milestone in the history of flight, but it was something that couldn't have been achieved in America 5 years before. Not all the successful passenger and mail transports of the time were monoplane trimotors. Curtiss Condors were big twin-engine biplanes that could carry 15 passengers. For a while, they were quite successful, but the world of air transportation was about to experience major change. In 1930, the year Bobby Jones won the Grand Slam of golf, American commercial aviation was in chaos. There were over 40 airlines operating, many coming into the business and disappearing quickly. Government subsidies to mail carriers made it more attractive to fly mail than passengers. In spite of the bright new fashion looks, these were hard times. Every form of government subsidy was welcome.
Gasoline was 10 cents a gallon, and we got this penny or penny and a half, whatever it was at the time, road tax refund if you kept your tank wagon slips and sent them into the state office. They'd refund you that tax money.
In 1930, the mail subsidy structure was changed and unprofitable airlines were forced to merge. TAT combined with Western Air, becoming Transcontinental and Western Air, TWA. Official post office encouragement of multi-engined aircraft for safety reasons doomed two highly innovative airplanes to short careers. One was the Northrop Alpha, a fast, streamlined monoplane that gained great strength from its stressed metal skin. The Alpha was the brainchild of talented designer Jack Northrop, who believed in all-metal airplanes and strived for cleanness and efficiency in his designs. The Alpha was capable of carrying passengers inside while the pilot sat out in the air. It could rush mail and delicate commodities like cut flowers and silkworms across the country in less than 24 hours. Its potential to carry passengers was poor. The cabin was claustrophobic, but its system of construction was brilliant and would have great influence on the design of future passenger aircraft. The other innovative plane to have a short career was the Boeing Monomail. It was similar in layout to the Alpha and also suffered because of its limited potential for passengers, but it taught Boeing valuable lessons for the future. This is a Lockheed Sirius, another Jack Northrop design in partnership with Gerald Vultee. This Sirius was owned by Charles Lindbergh and his wife Anne. It was fitted with floats in preparation for a flight they planned from New York to Tokyo in 1931, flying the Great Circle route. The Great Circle route is the shortest distance between 2 points on the Earth's curved surface. The Great Circle route between New York and Tokyo goes via Canada and Alaska. Anne Morrow Lindbergh was not an experienced flyer. She studied Morse code and radio operation to equip herself for the flight. Charles and Anne Morrow Lindbergh described their flight as having no start or finish, no diplomatic or commercial significance, with no records to be sought. In reality, it was an undertaking of great risk, demanding extreme courage and skill. It was also significant as an exploration of future international air routes. This was the first of a series of flights the Lindberghs made in the Sirius. In 1933, they flew around the western and eastern sides of the Atlantic, surveying air routes for Pan American. Charles Lindbergh made no concessions to his wife's inexperience. She had her jobs to perform, and she did them, learning as she went, in the process becoming a very efficient radio operator. The Lindberghs arrived in Tokyo in the Sirius in September 1931. After an enthusiastic welcome, they flew on to China, where the Sirius was damaged and had to be shipped back to America. It was a flight in the spirit of an age when all the boundaries of air transportation were being pushed outward, and it looked forward to a time when airplanes would fly easily and quickly between continents. Early in 1933, a brand new airplane emerged from the Boeing factory in Seattle and changed the face of commercial aviation. It was the Boeing 247, a streamlined twin-engine monoplane capable of carrying 10 passengers at far higher speeds and in far greater comfort than had ever been possible. The 247 was chosen from several Boeing design studies for a new generation commercial transport. Even before a prototype flew, Boeing's sister company, United Airlines, ordered 59 247s in the hope of gaining a lead on the rest of the airline industry. The 59 airplanes would cost a total of $4 million, an extremely large amount of money in those days. The engines would be built by Pratt & Whitney and the propellers by Hamilton Standard, both companies belonging to the United Aircraft Group. United Airlines order tied up Boeing's production facility for long enough to gain an advantage on its competitors. No other airline would be able to order 247s until United dominated the market. United's enthusiasm about the airplane seemed well-founded. Boeing promised high speed and a comfortable cabin insulated from weather and noise. When the first 247 flew, it delivered everything Boeing had promised.
Well, it really was quite a revolution in that it was capable of doing 200 miles an hour, averaging that ground speed, and it was also much quieter because the engine was not in the fuselage. The retractable landing gear, the constant speed propellers, all made it much faster and smoother, but it didn't carry too many people. But it was the forerunner of the modern airliner, for sure.
The 247 made its first transcontinental flight on June 12, 1933. Where the TAT trimotor service took 48 hours with the help of overnight trains, the 247 could make the trip by itself in around 20 hours. By that time, 30 247s were flying, and United's immense gamble appeared to be paying off. Passengers loved its speed and comfort. But for an airplane with such an immense initial impact, its service life was very short. This is one of the 4 Boeing 247s still in existence. It's being restored by the Seattle Museum of Flight. When it goes on display, it will be a tangible record of a great, if fleeting, achievement in air transportation. In designing and building the 247, Boeing made a conscious decision to favor a medium-sized airplane because of lower operating costs and higher speeds. The 247's fuel consumption was 360 gallons per 1,000 miles, compared with the Ford Trimotor's 675. But the Boeing airplane's 10-passenger capacity and its minimal potential for expansion was a major factor in its lack of long-term success. The cabin was narrow, and the spar of the cantilever wing had to be negotiated by any passenger walking up the aisle. A D model, faster and with a number of improvements, was introduced a year after the release of the original 247. But the improvements achieved too little and came too late. Small capacity was not the only reason for its demise. Another was the strategy of Boeing and United Airlines in keeping the 247 to themselves. It simply backfired. Donald Douglas, on the right, became a major figure in American aviation in 1921 when he set up his aircraft company at Santa Monica, California, and started to manufacture a series of successful airplanes, including the Douglas World Cruisers that became the first airplanes to fly around the world in 1924. Donald Douglas's daughter Barbara grew up as her father's company was expanding and his reputation as an aircraft manufacturer was growing. The Douglas home in Los Angeles was frequently visited by the small group of men whose vision was leading the development of the American aircraft industry. Barbara got to know them and admire their dedication to business.
They were very devoted Americans. They saw something that needed to be done, to be built. This was a mode of transportation that the world could enjoy, and for themselves it wasn't in there. I don't know, maybe it's the Scottish background, I don't know what it is, but they were not great money grabbers. My father used to say that all of his contracts early on with the military, that's before the World War II, were by a handshake. And that meant that whatever that price was, in 2 years when I produce it, or 1 year, that's what it will be. And after I have to hire the first lawyer, that's when I'm in trouble. we should be able to do business as gentlemen.
By the early 1930s, Donald Douglas and the heads of the other great aircraft companies had become powerful men.
I guess what people don't realize is there were so few people in the aviation business. We all knew each other. It would be less than 5 or 6 people that were involved in all of this. That's incomprehensible now.
At airfields around the country, people who could afford the cabin monoplanes and sporty biplanes of the late 20s and early 30s enjoyed aviation as a leisure pursuit. Many women learned to fly and contributed to the growth of aviation as a sporting activity. Surprisingly, for the daughter of one of America's great aviation families, Barbara Douglas was not one of them.
I didn't like it at all. I did very little of it. In fact, really, I never went in a small plane, and I still almost never will. They've got to have a couple of engines for me. I always listen for them to be sure they're working.
In 1932, Transcontinental and Western Airlines approached Douglas for a new airplane able to compete with United's Boeing 247s. The airplane that emerged from Douglas was the DC-1. It could carry 12 passengers, just 2 more than the Boeing 247. Only one was built. In 1934, it gave a taste of things to come when it flew airmail across the continent in just over 13 hours, taking 5 hours off the existing record. Its successor, the DC-2, could carry 14 passengers. The first DC-2 flew in May 1934, just a year after the introduction of the Boeing 247. The DC-2 emerged at a critical time. In early 1934, the new Postmaster General responded to accusations of collusion between the airlines in dealing with airmail contracts. As a result, President Franklin Roosevelt canceled all existing agreements. It was a major blow to the airline industry. When the Army agreed to fly the mail, several Army pilots were killed. Eventually, the service was returned to the airlines, but the mail subsidy was reduced and the large holding companies abolished. The DC-2 became available at the right time to take advantage of the situation and was immediately successful. By the middle of 1934, Douglas had orders for 75 aircraft. Barbara Douglas had the job of christening some of them.
I unwrapped an airplane in red cellophane over in San Fernando Valley at the old airport, which is now where the Lockheed Corporation began and their headquarters, that particular airfield. I've forgotten the name of it. Anyway, there I am, and it's totally covered in red cellophane. I think it is a TWA plane. I don't think it's been done before or since, but it was a little different than christening one with champagne.
In the 1930s, one of the most colorful figures in aviation was Colonel Roscoe Turner. He was famous for his feats in the air, but just as famous for his pet lion Gilmore, which was named after one of his sponsors. As long as Gilmore was small enough, he went along on Roscoe's flights equipped with his own parachute.
We had a very nice trip, although we had considerable storms. And we had a nice time in New York, didn't we, boy? Didn't we have a nice time in New York? Huh?
In 1934, a great air race was organized by Australian millionaire Sir Macpherson Robertson. It was to cover 11,500 miles from England to Australia. It was divided into a handicap section and an all-out speed dash halfway around the world. Roscoe Turner and Clyde Pangborn entered in a brand new Boeing 247D, modified with long-range fuel tanks. The race was due to begin on October 20th, and Turner spoke before he and Pangborn left for London.
As you know, we are going over to London to participate in the Mac Robertson International Race from London to Australia. And this race, of course, is the longest race ever conceived in history. And this is one time when weather will not get any consideration. When we start, we have to keep going. And
Turner explained his reasons for choosing a standard commercial airliner to fly in a competitive event like this.
Why we have selected this standard Boeing plane, because of its dependability, its speed, and its durability.
Before the race, the 247 wasn't seen as a potential winner. The image of a commercial airliner, even one as innovative as the 247, did not sit comfortably with the idea of air racing. There was a wide variety of airplanes entered. Some had no chance in the speed section of the race and hoped for a good placing on handicap. The British de Havilland Company designed an airplane especially for the race. It was called the Comet. One of the 3 Comets entered was piloted by C.W.A. Scott and T. Campbell Black.
We like the machine tremendously, and we hope a great deal for the machine, because we think it's capable of quite a lot. We haven't done very many tests on it yet, but we're very full of hope.
American Jackie Cochran was flying a single-engine Granville Brothers GB.
Saturday morning in the rain. We're having difficulty with the flaps on the aeroplane. But if we can overcome that, maybe we'll reach Melbourne, and if we don't, well, we're here anyway.
The King of England was present for the start of the race early in the morning of October 20th, 1934.
In the grey light of dawn, all is set for the start at 6:30.
At 6:30 a.m., the first of the 3 British Comets took off.
Flag drops. They're off. The race has started.
Compared with the Comet, Turner and Pangborn's 247 looked big and slow. There was another new American commercial airliner in the race, but it was entered by the Dutch airline KLM. It was a new Douglas DC-2. Jackie Cochran's GB was fast, but it had reliability problems. Jackie dropped out of the race in Romania. As predicted, the de Havilland Comet of Scott and Campbell Black was the first airplane into Melbourne, but the next 2 were surprises. They were the airliners, the KLM Douglas DC-2 and Roscoe Turner's Boeing 247. The KLM DC-2 took first place on handicap. The Boeing 247 took second place in the speed section and third place overall. An English reporter saw the significance of the performance by the 2 American airliners. He wrote that America now had hundreds of standard commercial airplanes with a higher top speed than the fastest airplane in regular service with the British Royal Air Force. But while the 247 performed beyond expectations, it had been beaten by a direct competitor. Its brief period as the fastest airliner in the world was almost over. In spite of their high performance and luxury appointments, the new airliners could still be unpleasant to fly in if the conditions were not quite right.
They bounce and they go up and down, and so does your stomach. So, of course, my concern was those nice little bags that none of you pay attention to anymore in airplanes, but were very, very helpful on that flight.
The Boeing 247 competed successfully with the DC-2 for a while, But when the DC-3 entered service in mid-1936, the battle was lost. The DC-3 arose out of American Airlines' need for a competitive transcontinental sleeper transport. The DC-2 wasn't wide enough, and Douglas reworked the design to increase the wingspan and lengthen and widen the body. The design changes had an immense effect on the potential of the airplane. American Airlines sleeper version had 14 berths, but the day plane version could accommodate 21 or more seats, more than twice the capacity of the Boeing 247. Given the reduction in mail subsidies, the airline suddenly had access to exactly what they needed, an airplane that could make money just by carrying passengers. The final indignity for Boeing occurred in 1936. United Airlines was no longer allied with Boeing. Realizing that its fleet of 247s had been outclassed, it ordered 5 DC-3s and 10 of the sleeper versions, the Douglas Sleeper Transport. The success of the DC-3 was not confined to America. Douglas already had substantial international sales with the DC-2, and now orders for the DC-3 poured in from all over the world. By 1938, DC-3s carried 95% of America's commercial airline traffic. The same year, they were being operated around the world by 30 different airlines. In 1939, DC-3s carried 90% of the world's airline traffic. Their potential was recognized by the military, and they were manufactured in large numbers for the armed forces, becoming famous as the C-47.
My mother had a wonderful statement. If you didn't build them so well, they'd buy more. But that was just a joke in the family, because they have lasted. They're still flying them today.
When production finished in 1947, more than 13,000 DC-3 civil and military variants had been built. Around the world, they were given many different names. In England and Europe, they were known as the Dakota. In America, they're remembered as the Goonie Bird. For airplanes designed in the early 30s and built before 1947, those still flying are capable of impressive performance. This display is being flown by the Dutch Dakota Association, one of the many organizations around the world that are dedicated to keeping this extraordinary airplane flying. As the wheels touch, the pilot orders full throttle. The old DC-3 performs a perfect touch and go. The DC-3 is one of the most important airplanes in the history of aviation. It has had immense influence in expanding the frontiers of flight.